The observation station sat silent on the dark side of Earth's moon, hidden beneath layers of technology that bent light and fooled sensors, in ways the primitive species below could not begin to understand. Vio. Tith pressed his four-fingered hand against the cold viewing panel and watched the blue planet rotate slowly in the endless black of space. He had been assigned to this mission by the High Council of the Cathari Dominion, a civilization that had conquered 17 intelligent species across 3 galactic arms over the past 10,000 years. His base task was simple enough: observe the dominant life forms on the third planet from this yellow star, assess their threat level, and prepare a report for the invasion fleet that would arrive in 6 standard cycles. The Cathari had never failed in a conquest. Their warships numbered in the tens of thousands, and their ground forces in the billions. They possessed weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand the heat of stars. Every species they had encountered had either submitted or been erased from existence. Vorth expected this assignment to be routine, perhaps even boring. He activated his monitoring equipment and began intercepting the electromagnetic signals that the humans broadcast carelessly into space. Their communications were unencrypted and easy to decode, which told him immediately that they had no concept of what lurked in the darkness between stars. Spent his first cycle learning their primary languages, a task made simple by the translation algorithms built into his neural implant. The humans had hundreds of different languages, which struck him as inefficient and foolish. A unified species would have unified communication. These creatures could not even agree on how to speak to each other. He studied their history next, accessing their primitive data networks with ease. What he found confirmed his initial assessment: humans were a violent and fractured species that spent most of their existence fighting among themselves. They had wars over territory, wars over resources, wars over ideas, and wars over things so trivial that Verteth could not translate them into concepts that made sense. They killed each other in enormous numbers with weapons that seemed almost comically crude: chemical propellants that launched metal projectiles, controlled explosions that released energy in destructive waves, bladed implements that required physical contact to cause harm. The Cathari had abandoned such primitive methods millennia ago. Verteth recorded his observations and transmitted them to Fleet Commander Zethra, who was assembling the Conquest Armada at a staging point 3 systems away. The humans present minimal threat, Verteth reported. They possess no faster-than-light capability, and their weapons are limited to chemical and nuclear technologies. Their space presence is confined to orbital stations and a few robotic probes in their inner system. I recommend a standard invasion force of 300 warships. The conquest should be complete within 4 planetary rotations. Fleet Commander Zethra acknowledged the report and began mobilizing forces. 300 ships was actually generous for a species this primitive, but the Cathari had learned long ago that it was better to overwhelm than vent. To underestimate Earth continued his observations, not because he expected to find anything significant, but because thoroughness was his duty. He studied human biology and found them to be remarkably fragile creatures. They could not breathe underwater. They could not see in darkness without artificial assistance. They could not survive temperature extremes that many Cathari would find merely uncomfortable. Their bodies were soft, lacking the natural armor that protected most sentient species. A single well-placed strike could kill them instantly. Their lifespans were laughably short. Most humans lived less than 100 of their planetary cycles before their bodies simply stopped functioning. The Cathari lived for nearly 1,000 standard years to Verteth. Humans seemed like mayflies, brief flickers of consciousness that appeared and vanished in what felt like moments. wondered if such short-lived creatures could even comprehend the vast timescales on which the galaxy operated. He wondered if they understood how insignificant they were. Vardith began to feel something that might have been pity, though that emotion was not highly valued among his people. These humans had built cities and created art and developed science and dreamed of reaching the stars, never knowing that the stars were already occupied by beings who would soon arrive to claim their world. They broadcast their location into the cosmos like children shouting in a forest full of predators. They had no idea what was coming. The analyst settled into his routine, monitoring human broadcasts and recording data for the invasion planners. He watched their entertainment programs, which often depicted humans fighting against alien invaders and somehow winning through courage and determination. Found these fictions amusing. Courage and determination meant nothing against superior firepower. The Cathari had learned this truth 17 times over. Every species believed they were special. Every species believed they would be the exception. Every species was wrong. He intercepted military communications and mapped their defense installations. Their largest naval vessels were confined to ocean travel. Their air forces relied on chemical burning engines that could barely escape their own atmosphere. Their nuclear arsenals, while impressive for a species at their development level, were designed to fight each other, not an enemy from space. It would take the Cathari approximately 1 hour to disable every military installation on the planet, simultaneously with calculated casualty projections and optimal landing zones. He identified population centers that would need to be controlled and resources that would need to be secured. The humans had abundant fresh water, diverse biological resources, and a planet that fell within comfortable habitation parameters for Cathari colonists. This world would make an excellent addition to the Dominion. He felt no guilt about what was to come. The strong consumed the weak. This was the natural order of the universe. The Cathari had not created this reality. They had simply accepted it and positioned themselves at the top of the hierarchy. If the humans had been stronger, faster, smarter, more unified, perhaps they would have had a chance, but they were none of these things. They were soft and short-lived and divided and primitive. They were prey that did not yet know it had been marked for transmitted. His updated assessment and prepared to enter a rest cycle. Everything was proceeding according to standard protocols. The invasion would be textbook, but as he dimmed the lights in his observation chamber, something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. Detail he had noticed in his research, but not fully processed. The humans had a phrase that appeared repeatedly in their historical records, spoken by individuals and groups facing overwhelming odds: "We will never surrender." Vartath had seen similar sentiments in other species before. Conquest was a common response to hopeless situations, defiant words spoken by beings who could not accept their inevitable defeat. The words meant nothing. Everyone surrendered eventually, or they died. He pushed the thought aside and entered his rest cycle outside his hidden station. The blue planet continued its slow rotation, unaware of the darkness gathering in the void beyond. 6 cycles remained until the arrival of the fleet. 6 cycles until the humans learned their place in the galactic order. Vergeth slept peacefully. Certain of the outcome, he would not sleep peacefully for much longer. 3 cycles into his observation mission, Vorteth intercepted a broadcast that would begin to change everything he thought he understood about humans. It was a sporting event, something the humans called the Ironman World Championship. He almost dismissed it as irrelevant entertainment data. But something about the visuals made him pause and watch. A human named Danny Crawford stood on a beach at dawn with hundreds of others. They wore minimal clothing and carried no equipment. When a signal sounded, they ran into the ocean and began swimming north. Watch Danny Crawford swim for nearly 4 kilometers through open water. Fighting waves and currents and the resistance of the liquid itself, the human's arms moved in rhythmic strokes, pulling him forward meter by meter through an environment that was not his natural habitat. When Danny Crawford emerged from the water, he did not rest. He mounted a 2-wheeled conveyance and began propelling himself forward, using only the muscles in his legs. Vorth checked his instruments to make sure they were functioning correctly. Human continued this activity for 180 kilometers, not powered by engines or technology, but by his own body, by the burning of calories and the contraction of muscle fibers and the force of his will. When Danny Crawford dismounted from the wheeled device, Vorth expected him to collapse. Instead, the human began running. He ran for 42 additional kilometers. Vorth calculated the total distance and the total time. This single fragile human had traveled over 220 kilometers under his own power in less than 9 standard hours. When Danny Crawford crossed the finish line, he embraced his offspring and consumed a beverage and smiled as if he had done nothing remarkable. Vorth rewound the footage and watched it again, checked his translation algorithms to make sure he had understood correctly. He had understood correctly. This was not a unique event. Thousands of humans competed in such races around their planet. Every year, many of them did it repeatedly, pushing themselves to go faster and farther each time. Vorth began researching human physical capabilities with a focus he had not applied before. What he discovered over the next several cycles would keep him awake during what should have been his rest periods. He learned about something called persistence hunting, a technique humans had used in their primitive past. Unlike most predators who relied on speed or ambush, humans would simply follow their prey at a steady pace for hours or sometimes days. They did not need to be faster. They only needed to be more persistent. The prey animals would run, and the humans would follow. The prey animals would rest, and the humans would keep coming. Eventually, the prey animals would collapse from exhaustion and die, and the humans would be there to claim them. This was possible because humans had developed the most efficient cooling system of any land animal on their planet. They sweated, releasing liquid from their skin that evaporated and carried away heat. This meant they could maintain physical activity in conditions that would cause other creatures to overheat and fail. But the cooling system alone did not explain what Vorth was seeing. He found records of a human named Katie Spots, who had rowed a small boat across the Atlantic Ocean by herself, 70 days alone on open water, pulling oars hour after hour, fighting currents and storms in the isolation of being completely alone in a vast and hostile environment. She did not do this because she had to. She did this because she chose to. Vorth found the concept almost impossible to process among the Cathari. Suffering was something to be avoided. Technology existed to eliminate unnecessary hardship. No Cathari would willingly subject themselves to prolonged physical torment for no practical purpose, but humans did it constantly. They climbed mountains that had no resources worth claiming. They ran distances that served no military purpose. They swam across bodies of water that could be crossed easily by boat. They called these activities sports and recreation, and they celebrated the individuals who pushed themselves the hardest. Vorth discovered a human named Dean Karnazes who had run 560 kilometers without stopping to sleep. He found records of a human named Diana Nyad who swam from one landmass to another through waters filled with dangerous predators at the age of 64. Read about something called the Barkley Marathons, a race so difficult that in many years no human completed it, yet they kept returning year after year to try again. Then Vorth found the story that would haunt his rest cycles. A human named Hugh Glass was part of an expedition in a region called the American Frontier. He was attacked by a large predator called a grizzly bear. The creature mauled him terribly. breaking bones and tearing flesh and leaving wounds so severe that his companions believed he would die within hours. They left him behind with a shallow grave already dug. Hugh Glass did not die with a broken leg and wounds that exposed his own ribs to the open air. He crawled and limped and dragged himself over 300 kilometers through wilderness filled with dangers. It took him 6 weeks when he arrived at his destination. He did not seek sympathy or rest. He sought the men who had abandoned him, driven by a desire for revenge that had kept him moving when his body should have stopped. Worth sat in his observation chamber and felt something cold spreading through his circulatory system. He had dismissed humans as fragile, but he was beginning to understand that fragility and weakness were not the same thing. The Cathari were strong because their bodies were durable. Their armor could turn blades and their limbs could crush stone, but the Cathari had never developed the kind of endurance he was witnessing in humans. They had never needed Tovertith thought about what it would mean to fight against a species that could simply refuse to stop. He thought about soldiers who could march for days without rest. He thought about resistance. Fighters who could survive injuries that would kill any Cathari thought about an enemy that did not know when it was supposed to die for the first time since arriving at his observation post. Verteth considered the possibility that he might have made an error in his initial assessment. He composed a supplemental report to Fleet Commander Zethra. Human physical endurance exceeds initial projections, he wrote. Recommend increasing ground force allocation by 30% to account for extended pacification timeline. The fleet commander acknowledged the amendment but made no changes to the invasion plan. 300 warships would still be sufficient. The Cathari had overwhelming technological superiority no amount of endurance could overcome. Orbital bombardment for the fleet commander was right, but late in his rest cycle, he found himself watching the footage of Danny Crawford crossing that finish line again. The human had pushed his body beyond what should have been possible. And when it was over, he had simply smiled. What kind of species could do that? And Smalverteth was beginning to fear he was about to find out. Varteth had initially viewed human wars as evidence of a primitive and self-destructive species. Now, he began studying them as a military analyst should, looking for patterns and capabilities and the true nature of human combat. What he found made his previous concerns seem trivial. He started with the conflict humans called World War II, a global war that had killed approximately 70 million of them in just 6 years. The numbers alone were staggering. No Cathari war had ever produced casualties on that scale relative to population, but it was not the numbers that disturbed Verteth. It was how those numbers had been achieved. He studied the siege of Stalingrad, where 2 human factions had fought over a single city for more than 5 months. The conditions were brutal, extreme cold, limited supplies, constant combat. Soldiers fought building to building, room to room, sometimes hand to hand in the rubble of destroyed structures. The casualties exceeded 2 million humans killed or wounded fighting over one city, and neither side retreated. They fed more soldiers into the destruction day after day, accepting losses that would have shattered any Cathari force, until one side simply had no more soldiers left to send. Vertith tried to imagine any Cathari commander continuing an assault after losing even 10% of their forces in a single engagement. It was unthinkable. The doctrine of acceptable losses existed to prevent exactly this kind of wasteful destruction, but humans seemed to have no such doctrine. They would fight until they won or until every last one of them was dead. He found individual accounts that were even more disturbing. A human named Ben Salomon was a medical officer treating wounded soldiers. When enemy forces overran his position, standard protocol for any species would be to surrender or flee. A medic was not a combatant, and his value lay in healing rather than fighting. Ben Salomon did not Surrender or flee, he ordered his patients to evacuate and positioned himself at the entrance to his medical tent with an automatic weapon when his body was recovered after the battle. 98 enemy soldiers lay dead around him. He had fought alone against nearly 100 opponents, knowing he could not win, knowing he would die. And he had done it anyway to give his wounded patients time to escape. Vertith. Read the account 3 times to make sure he understood. Then he found more accounts, just like it. Roy Benavides was a human soldier who flew into a combat zone to rescue wounded comrades who were surrounded by enemy forces during the operation. He was shot multiple times in the legs, arms and abdomen. He was stabbed with a bayonet. His jaw was broken by the butt of an enemy rifle. Any one of these injuries should have incapacitated him. Roy Benavides continued fighting for 6 hours. He carried wounded soldiers to evacuation aircraft while bleeding from dozens of wounds. He killed enemy combatants with his hands when his weapons fighting was finally over, and he was placed in a body bag because the medics believed he was dead. He gathered enough strength to spit in a doctor's face to prove he was still alive. Set down his data pad and stared at the wall of his observation chamber. Cathari had pain inhibitors built into their neural systems. They had emergency shutdown protocols that would render a soldier unconscious if their injuries exceeded certain thresholds. These were safety features designed to preserve valuable soldiers for future battles. Humans had no such features. They felt every wound, experienced every moment of agony, and they kept fighting anyway. They kept fighting through pain that would have shut down any Cathari nervous system. Vorth expanded his research to human weapons development. He had dismissed their nuclear arsenals as primitive, but now he looked more closely at what these weapons represented. Humans had developed the ability to destroy their entire planet. They had built enough nuclear weapons to render their world uninhabitable. Multiple times over, they had come close to using these weapons on several occasions, stopped only by the decisions of individual humans who chose not to end their species, and then they had simply continued living with these weapons pointed at each other. They went to work and raised families and built civilizations with extinction hanging over them every single day. Had normalized apocalypse. The Cathari had weapons of mass destruction, but they were kept in secure facilities far from population centers, used only against enemy worlds. Humans kept their doomsday devices armed and ready, accepting the possibility of total annihilation as a reasonable cost of their political disagreements. What kind of species could function like that? What kind of minds could accept that reality and not go mad? Vertith found himself researching human psychology, trying to understand the mental structures that allowed for this behavior. He discovered concepts that had no equivalent in Cathari language. Acceptable losses meant something different to humans. To the Cathari, it meant the minimum casualties necessary to achieve an objective. To humans, it often meant everyone, if necessary. Vertith read about human pilots who flew aircraft directly into enemy ships, sacrificing themselves to cause damage. Read about human soldiers who threw themselves onto explosive devices to shield their companions with their own bodies. He read about human civilians who refused to evacuate from war zones because they would not leave their homes, choosing to die in familiar places rather than flee to safety. Every Cathari soldier was trained to preserve their own life when possible. Every Cathari knew that living to fight another day was superior to dying in a gesture of defiance. Humans did not seem to share this belief. They would die for causes, for principles, for other humans, for things that provided no tactical advantage whatsoever. They would die simply to prove that they could not be made to surrender. Vorth composed an urgent amendment To his invasion report, human psychological resilience significantly exceeds projections, he wrote. Recommend increasing invasion force to 800 warships. Recommend orbital bombardment of major population centers before ground engagement. Recommend total annihilation protocol rather than occupation and subjugation. Fleet Commander Zethra reviewed the amendment with what Verteth detected as irritation. Your concerns are noted. The reply stated, however, the Dominion has never required more than 300 ships for any conquest. Your recommendation would tie up resources needed for other operations. The invasion will proceed as planned. Verteth read the response and felt the cold sensation in his circulatory system. HFY. The Fleet Commander did not understand. Fleet Commander had not seen what Verteth had seen. Fleet Commander did not know what humans were capable of when they decided that death was preferable to defeat, but Verteth was only an analyst. His role was to observe and report, not to command. The invasion would proceed as the Fleet Commander decided, and the humans would face the might of the Tethari Dominion with their primitive weapons, and their fragile bodies, and their inexplicable willingness to die rather than submit. Verteth was no longer certain of the outcome, but he was certain that whatever happened would not be the quick and clean conquest the Fleet Commander expected. Verteth had studied human bodies and human warfare, but he had not yet fully examined the human mind. He began this research hoping to find weaknesses the Cathari could exploit, psychological vulnerabilities that would make conquest easier. Instead, he found something that made his fear grow deeper and colder with every passing cycle. He started with survivors. Humans who had endured situations that should have killed Thema. Human named Louis Zamperini had been a soldier in one of their great wars. His aircraft crashed into the ocean, killing most of the crew. Louis and 2 companions survived on a small inflatable raft for 47 days, floating in open water with no fresh water and no hope of rescue during those 47 days. They fought off predators that tried to capsize their raft. They caught rainwater with their hands and ate raw fish when they could catch them. One of his companions died from the ordeal. Louis Zamperini kept the other one alive through sheer force of will, refusing to let him give up. When they finally reached land, they were captured by enemy forces. Louis spent the next 2 years in prison camps, where he was systematically beaten and tortured and humiliated by guards who seemed determined to break his spirit. He was singled out for special abuse because he had been a famous athlete before the war. Guards wanted to prove that they could destroy this symbol of human achievement. They failed. Louis Zamperini survived the war and returned home, and lived for decades more. And then he did something that Verteth found almost impossible to comprehend. Went back to the place where he had been tortured, and he publicly forgave the men who had tried to break him. He did not seek revenge or demand justice or harbor hatred. He simply decided to let it go and move forward with his life. Verteth stared at this information for a long time. Cathari did not forgive. Grievances were remembered across generations and settled when opportunity arose. The concept of releasing hatred voluntarily was alien to everything Verteth understood about sentient behavior. But it was not the forgiveness that disturbed him most. It was the survival. It was the refusal to break, even when breaking was the logical response. He expanded his research and found this pattern repeated throughout human history. Humans who should have died, but decided not to. Humans who should have surrendered, but refused. Humans who had every reason to give up, but kept going out of pure stubbornness. He discovered a concept that humans called spited. First, he thought his translation algorithms were malfunctioning because the concept made no rational sense. Spite meant harming yourself specifically to harm someone else. More humans had a phrase for this behavior: cutting off the nose to spite the face. They would accept damage to themselves if it meant their enemy suffered greater damage. They would sacrifice their own well-being for the satisfaction of denying their enemy. Victory the Cathari had no equivalent concept to. Damage oneself for emotional satisfaction was not something his species could process. But humans did it routinely. They did it in their wars and in their personal relationships and in their business dealings and in every aspect of their existence. If you pushed a human too hard, they might destroy themselves just to ensure you did not get what you wanted. Try to model how this would affect combat operations. If humans would accept their own destruction to deny the Cathari victory, then standard conquest protocols would not apply. You could not threaten creatures who had already accepted death. You could not negotiate with beings who valued defiance more than survival. He found more evidence of this psychology in human responses to challenges when humans were told something was impossible. A significant percentage of them would attempt it specifically because they had been told it could not be done. They treated limitations as personal insults. They viewed the word never as a challenge rather than a statement of fact the human named. Julian Kopke had fallen 3 kilometers from an aircraft into dense jungle wilderness. The plane had broken apart in a storm and she had plummeted through the sky, still strapped to her seat. She should have died from the fall. She did not. She landed in the jungle canopy and survived with injuries that included a broken collarbone, a deep wound on her leg, and a concussion. She was 17 years old, alone in the wilderness, surrounded by dangerous animals and diseases and terrain that would challenge even experienced survivors. Julianne walked for 11 days through the jungle, following water sources, fighting infection, eating nothing, until she found human habitation. When asked later how she had survived when everyone else on the aircraft had died, she gave an answer that Verteth would remember for the rest of his existence. She said she had decided to live. That was all. She had simply decided that she would not die in that jungle. And then she had made that decision real through action. Verteth thought about what it would mean to fight against a species that could decide to survive. He thought about enemies who would keep coming because they had chosen not to stop. He thought about resistance fighters who would refuse to surrender because they had decided that surrender was not an option. Composed what he knew would be his final attempt to change the invasion plan. I have spent 6 cycles studying this species, he wrote to Fleet Commander Zethra. I have analyzed their physiology and their history and their psychology. I must now provide my honest assessment as a senior analyst of the Dominion. These creatures are not like anything we have conquered before. They will not submit. They will not break. They will fight until they are dead and possibly beyond. I recommend abandoning this conquest entirely and leaving the humans to develop in isolation. If we must proceed, I recommend a force of no less than 2,000 warships and a strategy of complete planetary sterilization. Anything less will result in losses we cannot predict or control. Fleet Commander Zethra's response arrived within hours. Your recommendations have been reviewed and rejected. The message stated, the Council has noted your increasingly irrational assessments and questions whether your isolation has affected your judgment. The invasion will proceed on schedule with 300 warships. You will remain at your observation post to document the conquest for historical archives. Your analysis duties are concluded. Verteth read the message and understood what it meant. He had failed to convince them. They would learn the truth about humans the hard way, and he would be there to watch it happen. He looked out at the blue planet, rotating slowly in the darkness. Somewhere down there, billions of humans were living their lives, unaware that in just a few cycles, everything would change. They would wake up one morning to find alien warships in their sky. They would hear demands for surrender, broadcast in their own languages. They would face the might of a civilization that had crushed 17 species before them, and unlike those 17 species, Verteth now believed the humans would not kneel. They would fight. They would die in numbers that would stagger the Dominion. They would lose cities and nations, and perhaps their entire world. But They would not stop because humans did not stop. That was the thing the fleet commander did not understand. That was the thing no Cathari could understand until they saw it themselves. Humans did not stop until they decided to stop. Varteth had seen nothing in his research to suggest they would ever decide to stop fighting an invader. He settled into his observation post and waited for the fleet to arrive. Had done everything he could. Now he would simply watch and record and hope that somehow, against everything he believed would happen, the Cathari would prove him wrong. The invasion began on what humans called a Tuesday 300 Cathari. Warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and took positions around Earth, their weapons arrays charging with enough power to crack continents Vorth watched from his observation post on the moon as the fleet arranged itself in standard conquest formation. He had seen this sight before. Over other worlds, against other species, it had always ended the same way. The target species would resist briefly, realize the hopelessness of their situation, and submit to Cathari rule. Within 4 rotations, occupation forces would be establishing control centers and beginning the integration of the new territory into the Dominion Fleet. Commander Zethra broadcast the standard terms of surrender in every human language simultaneously. Message was simple: submit within 1 planetary rotation, or face extinction. Humans were given 24 of their hours to accept their new reality. For the first few hours, chaos reigned on the planet below. Governments issued conflicting statements. Militaries scrambled to defensive positions. Civilian populations panicked and fled and prayed to their various gods for salvation. Vorth monitored the communications and saw exactly what he expected: confusion, fear, desperation. What he did not see was surrender. The deadline passed. Not a single human government had submitted. Fleet commander Zethra seemed almost amused by this defiance. He ordered the demonstration strike, a standard tactic designed to show primitive species the futility of resistance. 12 military installations across 6 continents were reduced to molten glass in less than an hour. Every satellite and space-based asset was destroyed in the 2nd hour. By the 3rd hour, Cathari ground forces were establishing positions on every major landmass. The conquest had begun. Vorth expected organized resistance to collapse within days. It did not collapse. It adapted human military forces that should have been destroyed in the initial strikes had dispersed into civilian populations, hiding their weapons and their command structures in ways the Cathari sensors could not detect. Guerrilla attacks began within hours of ground force deployment. Supply lines were ambushed. Communication relays were sabotaged. Isolated units were overwhelmed by swarms of humans who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The first Cathari casualty reports surprised Fleet Commander Zethryth. 2nd week's reports alarmed him. By the end of the 1st month, he had requested reinforcements from the Dominion High Council. Vorth watched it all from his observation post, recording everything. He watched a human pilot named Katie Morrison fly her damaged aircraft directly into a Cathari command ship. After her weapons were depleted, she could have ejected and survived. Instead, she stayed at the controls and steered her craft into the ship's bridge, killing herself and the senior officers aboard. She was singing as she died. Varteth could hear it on the intercepted communications, a song about not fearing death, about going down fighting, about never giving up. He watched human civilians refuse evacuation from a contested city because they would not abandon their pets. The Cathari did not understand companion animals, did not understand the bond between humans and the creatures they had domesticated. These humans fought with improvised weapons, with knives and clubs and bottles filled with burning chemicals, and they died by the hundreds, but they would not leave. He watched a human child named Max, no more than 12 years old by their counting, detonate an explosive device in a Cathari supply depot. The explosion destroyed 3 months of provisions and killed 17 Cathari soldiers. The child's last recorded words were a message to his grandmother, telling her not to worry about him. He was 12 years old, and he had chosen to die for his species. The reinforcements arrived, another 200 warships, another 100,000 ground troops. It was not enough. The humans learned from every engagement. They captured Cathari weapons and figured out how to use them within days. They captured Cathari technology and reverse engineered it within weeks. They found weaknesses in Cathari armor that the Dominion's own engineers had not recognized, and they exploited those weaknesses with brutal efficiency. Voth watched Fleet Commander Zethra grow increasingly frustrated and desperate. Standard tactics were not working. Overwhelming force was not working. Nothing was working against an enemy who simply refused to stop fighting 1 year into the invasion. The Cathari controlled less territory than they had after the first month. Their casualties had exceeded every projection, every worst-case scenario, every nightmare. 2 years into the invasion, they were struggling to maintain defensive positions around their own landing zones. Vertith watched Fleet Commander Zethra die on the steps of what had been the human central government building in a place called Washington. A human woman named Sophie put a blade through his thoracic cavity while 3 of his guards restrained her. She continued stabbing even as they killed her, driving the blade deeper with each thrust until her own heart stopped. She died with a smile on her face. 3 years into the invasion, Verteth is the last surviving member of the original fleet. He hides in the ruins of a human city, moving every few cycles to avoid patrols. His beacon has been transmitting for 700 rotations. No Cathari ship has responded. He does not believe any will. Humans found his observation post on the moon 6 months ago. They did not destroy it. They are using it now, studying Cathari technology, mapping the stars, preparing for something that Verteth can only imagine. He intercepted their communications before he went into hiding. They are not talking about rebuilding their world. They are talking about finding the Cathari homeworld. They are talking about making sure this never happens to anyone else. They are talking about vengeance. Severeth knows they will succeed. Knows because he has spent 3 years watching them do impossible things. He knows because he has seen them refuse to die when death was the only logical option. He knows because he has watched them turn every defeat into a lesson and every lesson into a weapon. Cathari thought they were the apex predators of the galaxy. They thought their technology and their numbers and their 1,000-year history of conquest made them invincible. They did not understand what they were facing. They did not understand that humans were forged by a world that tried to kill them every day of their evolution. They did not understand that short lifespans had taught humans to fight without fear of death. They did not understand that fragility had taught humans to be clever and adaptive and absolutely ruthless when threatened. They did not understand that a species accustomed to fighting itself would not hesitate to turn those skills against an outside. Ameverth understands now. He understands as he hides in the shadows of a ruined city, listening to human patrols pass by, knowing that his species is about to face the consequences of underestimating a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. He's recording this account because someone should know what happened here. Someone should know how the mighty Cathari Dominion, conquerors of 17 species, met their end. They came to Earth expecting easy prey. They found humanity instead, and from the very first moment, from the very first shot fired, from the very first human who refused to kneel, they never had a chance not. Even Vertith finishes his recording and looks up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Cathari homeworld waits in ignorance of the storm that is coming. The humans are coming, and they do not know how to stop.